The wind in Wyoming was not merely a weather condition. It was a living, breathing antagonist that stripped the paint from the siding of houses and the hope from the hearts of those foolish enough to settle there. It did not blow in gusts, but in a relentless, solid wall of force that leaned against the buildings of Silver Creek day and night. In the summer, it carried the taste of alkali dust and dried sage, coating teeth and tongues in a grit that water could not wash away. In the spring, it turned the thawing earth into a sucking, brown mud that swallowed boots and wagon wheels alike. But in the winter, the wind became a butcher. It screamed down from the blue-gray peaks of the distant mountains, sharpening the snow into blades of ice that could freeze a man's lungs or bury a herd of cattle standing upright. Lila Mercer knew the wind better than she knew the sound of her own laughter. She woke to it every morning before the sun had even thought to grace the eastern horizon. The house was always cold at 4 a.m, a hollow, biting chill that settled in the marrow of her bones. She would slide from the warmth of the quilt, careful not to disturb the heavy, motionless lump that was her husband. Edwin. If she woke him, there would be words, sharp and dry as the summer grass, about her clumsiness or her inability to move with the grace of a proper wife. She dressed in the dark, her fingers stiff and fumbling with the buttons of her high-necked calico dress. Her breath hung in white plumes before her face as she moved to the kitchen. The wood stove was a black iron beast that demanded to be fed, and Lila knelt before it like a supplicant, scraping out the gray ash of yesterday's fire and arranging the kindling with practiced, trembling hands. She had to have the coffee boiling and the biscuits rising by the time Edwin placed his boots on the floorboards. That was the rule. Unspoken, perhaps, but etched into the air of the house just as deeply as the 10 Commandments were etched into the stone tablets depicted in the stained glass of the town church. Lila was 24 years old, but in the reflection of the darkened window, she sometimes saw a woman twice that age. Her hair was the color of wheat that had stood too long in the sun, pulled back severely into a knot that pulled at her temples. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, like the sky after a storm, and they held a permanent expression of waiting for the kettle to whistle, waiting for the winter to break, waiting for a permission she knew would never come. She took the heavy tin pail and went out to the pump in the yard. The ground was frozen iron hard. The handle of the pump was rimed with frost, and it took the full weight of her shoulder to work it up and down until the water sputtered and flowed. The cold bit through her shawl, stinging her skin, but she did not hurry. Out here, under the fading stars, she was alone. There was no one to critique the way she walked or the way she held her head. For a moment, she could look at the jagged silhouette of the mountains and remember that the world was wide, even if her portion of it had shrunk to the size of a general store and a cold bedroom. She remembered a time before the shrinking. She remembered a wagon train moving west, the smell of canvas and oxen, and the sound of her father playing a fiddle by the firelight. That was a lifetime ago. The accident at the river crossing had taken them both. Her mother swept away by the current. Her father crushed trying to save the wagon. Lila had been 16, a terrified girl with nothing but a trunk of clothes and a hymnal. The town had not known what to do with her. An orphan was a burden on the frontier. And then Edwin Mercer had stepped forward. He was older, established, a man who ran the only general store in Silver Creek and owned a sprawling, failing ranch on the outskirts of town. He was considered a catch by the spinsters of the church, a man of steady habits and God-fearing reputation. He had offered marriage not as a proposal, but as a solution to a problem of logistics. He needed a wife to manage his home and work his counter. She needed a roof to keep the snow off her head. It was a transaction, sealed with a handshake and a grim ceremony in the parsonage. She had traded her freedom for security, and every day since, she had paid the interest on that debt in silence. By the time the sun finally breached the horizon, painting the plains in deceptive golds and pinks, Lila was already at work in the store attached to the front of the house. Mercer's General Mercantile was the heart of Silver Creek, smelling of roasted coffee beans, cured leather, sawdust, and kerosene. It was Lila's domain, Though she owned none of it, she swept the floorboards, arranged the bolts of fabric, and weighed out sacks of flour and sugar. Edwin entered at 7. He was a tall man, thickening around the middle, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain. His sideburns were graying, and his eyes were the color of slate, hard and unreadable. He did not say good morning. He went straight to the ledger on the counter, running his finger down the columns of numbers, searching for errors. "The coffee is weak today," he said without looking up. "I use the same measure as always." "Edwin," Lila replied softly, dusting a row of canned peaches. "Then you measured poorly," he said. His voice was not loud. Edwin rarely shouted. He did not have to. His voice was a flat, heavy thing that brooked no argument. "Waste is a sin. Lila, a prudent wife looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Nor does she waste the beans of industry." "I will be more careful," she said. "See that you are—" The bell above the door jingled, signaling the first customer. It was Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, a woman whose bonnet was always stiff with starch and whose eyes darted around the room like swallows, looking for dust or scandal. "Good morning, Sister Mercer." "Mrs. Gable chirped, bringing a gust of cold air with her. "Brother Mercer, I trust the Lord has kept you well this fine morning. We are blessed." "Mrs. Gable," Edwin said, his voice instantly changing. It became warm, expansive, the voice of the respected merchant. "The Lord provides for the righteous. How can we serve you?" Lila watched the transformation with a dull ache in her chest. This was the Edwin the town knew, the pillar of the community. The man who sat in the front pew every Sunday and nodded solemnly at the preacher's sermons on damnation and duty. They did not know the man who counted every lump of coal that went into the stove, or the man who inspected the linens for wrinkles with a candle in his hand, as Mrs. Gable chattered about the upcoming social at the church hall. Lila moved to measure out a pound of dried beans. Her mind drifted, a dangerous habit she tried to curb. She found herself looking at the shelf where Edwin kept the few luxury items, fancy soaps from St. Louis, ribbons of silk, and a single, small volume of poetry that had arrived by mistake in a shipment of Bibles. She had touched the book once, feeling the texture of the binding, reading a single line about a nightingale before Edwin had snatched it away. "Poetry is for dreamers, Lila," he had said then, "and dreams do not plow fields or balance ledgers." "Lila, Mrs. Gable said, her voice sharp. "I asked if you would be contributing a pie for the social?" Lila blinked, snapping back to the present. I suppose so, if Edwin can spare the sugar." Edwin smiled, a tight stretching of his lips. "My wife would be delighted. Mrs. Gable, charity is the first duty of the Christian home." Mrs. Gable nodded, satisfied. "It is good to see you keeping her busy, Brother Mercer, idle hands, as they say. I saw Mrs. Miller laughing in the street yesterday with that new blacksmith, laughing like a schoolgirl. It is shameful. A woman's reputation is like a sheet of paper. Once crumpled, it can never be smooth again." "Indeed," Edwin agreed solemnly. "We must guard our hearts." When Mrs. Gable left, the warmth vanished from Edwin's face. He turned to Lila, his eyes narrowing. "You were wool gathering again," he said. "I am sorry. Edwin, sorry does not fill the till. And do not speak of what I can spare. It makes us sound destitute." "We are not destitute. We are prudent." He reached out and took her wrist. It was a casual gesture, or so it would have looked to anyone watching from the street, but his grip was iron. He squeezed, his thumb pressing into the tender tendons on the underside of her arm. It was not enough to break bone, but it was enough to send a shock of pain shooting up to her shoulder. Lila stood perfectly still, her face a mask. She had learned long ago that pulling away only made him squeeze harder. "Pay attention, Lila," he whispered. "You are a reflection of me. Do not embarrass me with your vagueness." "Yes, Edwin." He released her and turned back to his ledger as if nothing had happened. Lila rubbed her wrist, her skin burning. She went back to the beans, her hands moving automatically, but inside, a quiet desperation was clawing at her throat. This was her life. This was all there was, The dust, the wind, the ledger, the grip on her wrist. The day wore on, slow and gray. The wind picked up around noon, rattling the storefront windows in their frames. The town of Silver Creek hunkered down. It was a place built on the promise of cattle and silver. But the silver had played out and the cattle were dying in the droughts that had plagued the territory for 2 years running. The people who remained were hard, cured by the elements like jerky. They were suspicious of outsiders and cruel to their own. Lila could feel the eyes of the town on her whenever she stepped outside. The church ladies, with their tight buns and tighter mouths, watched for any sign of impropriety. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, thundered from the pulpit every Sunday about the weakness of Eve and the treacherous nature of women. "The heart of a woman is a vessel," he would shout, sweat beading on his forehead. "If it is not filled with the Holy Spirit, the devil will fill it with longing. And longing, brothers and sisters, is the first step toward the pit." Lila often wondered if she was already in the pit. She felt the longing. Not for another man. She knew no other men. Not really, but for something soft. For a kind word. For music. For the feeling of the sun on her face without the worry of work to be done. It was late afternoon when the bell jingled again. The wind howled as the door opened, blowing a drift of grit across the freshly swept floor. A man stepped inside, pushing the door shut against the gale with a heavy shoulder. He stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light of the store. He was not a town man. That was obvious from his boots to the brim of his hat. He was covered in the dust of the trail, a fine gray powder that coated his coat and settled in the creases of his neckerchief. He was tall, lean in the way of a wolf that has run too many miles without a kill. He wore a long canvas duster that had seen better years, and a gun belt hung low on his hips, the leather worn, smooth and dark. Edwin looked up from his counter, his suspicion rising like the hackles on a dog. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice clipped. The stranger took off his hat, revealing dark hair plastered to his forehead by sweat and hat brim pressure. He had a face that might have been handsome once, before the territory got to it. Now it was weary. There was a scar, a jagged white line that ran from the corner of his jaw down into his collar, disappearing beneath his shirt. It gave him a lopsided, dangerous look, but his eyes were surprisingly calm. They were brown, the color of wet earth, and they held a depth of exhaustion that Lila recognized instantly. "I hope so," the man said. His voice was low, rasping slightly as if he had swallowed a cup of that Wyoming dust. "My horse is blown. I need grain, and I could use some supplies for myself if you have coffee and beans." "We have them," Edwin said. "Cash only. No credit for drifters." The man nodded slowly. "I have cash." He walked toward the counter, his gait uneven. He favored his left leg, a slight hitch in his step that spoke of a broken bone poorly set or a bullet that had found a home in the muscle. He stopped at the counter and placed a few coins on the wood. They were silver dollars, worn smooth. 5 pounds of grain. The man said, 2 of beans, 1 of coffee, and a tin of tobacco. Edwin weighed the items with agonizing slowness, checking the scales twice. Lila stood by the dry goods shelves, clutching a bolt of blue fabric she had been refolding. She could not take her eyes off the stranger. It was not just that he was new. It was the way he stood. He did not posture. He did not try to take up space like the cowboys who came into town on Saturday nights to drink and brawl. He stood with a quiet stillness, his hands resting on the counter, relaxed but ready. Edwin pushed the sacks across the counter. "That will be $3. Prices are high," the man noted, though he did not reach for his gun or raise his voice. "Freight costs," Edwin lied smoothly. "It is a long way from the railhead." The man pushed the coins forward without argument. He turned to leave, but then he paused. His eyes moved over the shelves and landed on Lila. For a second, the world stopped turning. Lila felt the breath catch in her throat. He looked at her not as a fixture of the store, not as Brother Mercer's wife, but as a human being, standing in the shadows, His gaze was not predatory. It was simply seeing. He saw the red, chapped skin of her hands clutching the fabric. He saw the slump of her shoulders. He saw the ghost in her eyes. And she saw him. She saw the loneliness that radiated off him like heat from a stove. She saw a man who had ridden 1,000 miles and found nowhere to rest. Edwin cleared his throat. A sharp, grating sound. "Lila," he barked. "Do not just stand there staring. The gentleman might like a cup of coffee from the pot before he goes back out into the cold. It is good business." It was a test. Lila knew it. Edwin wanted to see if she would be flustered. He wanted to assert his command over her in front of this stranger. "Yes, Edwin," she whispered. She went to the stove at the back of the store and poured a cup of the thick, black sludge that had been simmering since noon. Her hands trembled slightly, rattling the cup against the saucer. She walked to the counter and set it down in front of the stranger. "Here," she said softly. "It is hot." The man looked from the cup to her face. He smiled, and the expression transformed him. It did not erase the scar or the weariness, but it softened the hard lines of his mouth. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. He said it with such sincerity, such quiet gravity, that Lila felt a flush rise to her cheeks. It was not the perfunctory thanks of a customer. It was a genuine offering. "You are welcome," she murmured, dropping her eyes. Edwin watched the exchange, his eyes narrowing into slits. He drummed his fingers on the ledger. "You riding through?" Edwin asked. His voice tight. "Looking for work," the man said, taking a sip of the coffee. He did not wince at the bitterness. "I handle horses. Cattle, too. I am handy with a fence tool." Edwin snorted. "Every saddle tramp in the territory claims to be handy. The ranches are laying men off, not hiring. The drought is killing the herds. I noticed," the man said. "But I am willing to work cheap, and I do not shy away from hard labor." Edwin paused. Lila could see the gears turning in his mind. Greed was battling with suspicion. Edwin's ranch was failing because he was too cheap to hire enough men to manage it properly. He had lost 20 head of cattle just last week because the fences were down in the north pasture and he refused to pay the local wages to fix them. "How cheap?" Edwin asked. $20 a month and a roof," the man said. Edwin laughed. A harsh bark. $20. A top hand gets 30. "I am not asking for top wages," the man said evenly. "Just a place to winter and fair pay for fair work." 15, Edwin countered instinctively. "And you sleep in the bunkhouse. There is no fire in there, but it is dry." The stranger looked at Edwin for a long moment. He seemed to be measuring the man, weighing his soul on a set of invisible scales. Then he nodded. 20, the man said again, softly but with a steel core. "And I will fix that north fence line you mentioned to the sheriff yesterday." Edwin stiffened. He hated being out-negotiated, but he loved a bargain. A hand who could fix fences and work cattle for $20 was a steal, and he knew it. 18, Edwin said. "And you buy your own tobacco. Meals are included, but you eat in the kitchen, not at the table." The man finished his coffee and set the cup down gently. "Done." "Name?" Edwin asked, dipping his pen into the inkwell. "Cole," the man said. "Cole Ryder." Edwin wrote it down in the ledger, scratching the nib across the paper as if he were carving the name into stone. "Start tomorrow. The bunkhouse is round the back. You can put your horse in the lean-to for tonight." Cole Ryder nodded. He turned to Lila one last time. He touched the brim of his hat. "Thank you for the coffee, ma'am. It saved my life." He turned and walked out into the wind, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him, oblivious to the tension he had left in his wake. Edwin stared at the door for a long time after it closed. Then he turned his gaze on Lila. She felt it like a physical weight. "He is a stray dog," Edwin muttered. "But he will work until the snow flies. Then we will see." He looked at the cup on the counter. "You filled it too full," he said. Lila did not answer. She took the cup and turned away to wash it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. That night, the wind rose to a shriek. The shutters on the bedroom window rattled in their frames. a chaotic rhythm that usually kept Lila awake with anxiety. But tonight, she barely heard them. She lay rigid on her side of the bed, careful not to touch Edwin. He was snoring, a rhythmic, congested sound that smelled of stale tobacco and self-righteousness. The room was freezing. The fire in the stove had died down hours ago, and the cold was creeping out from the corners of the room. But Lila felt a strange heat. She closed her eyes and saw the stranger's face. Cole Ryder. She saw the scar. She wondered how he had gotten it. A knife fight? A fall from a horse? It made him look broken, but in a way that suggested he had put himself back together. She thought of the way he had said, "Thank you." "Ma'am?" It echoed in her mind. It was just a courtesy. It meant nothing. He was a drifter, a hired hand who would be gone as soon as the grass turned green in the spring. "Do not be a fool. Lila," she told herself. "Guard your heart. The preacher is right. The heart is treacherous." But she could not stop the feeling. It was fear. Yes. Edwin would destroy her if he sensed even a flicker of disloyalty. But beneath the fear was something else. A fragile, terrifying hope. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and acknowledged that she existed. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, staring into the dark. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, tearing at the roof, searching for a way in. Somewhere, out in the cold bunkhouse, Cole Ryder was sleeping. He was only 50 yards away. Lila closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not pray for patience. She did not pray for strength to endure her burdens. She simply breathed, and in the silence of her own mind, she whispered his name. "Cole." The wind answered with a moan, and Lila fell into a restless sleep, dreaming of scars and silver dollars and the dangerous promise of a winter storm. The bunk room was not truly a room at all. It was a lean-to addition tacked onto the north side of the house like an afterthought, built from rough-hewn planks that had warped with the seasons. It had originally been intended for storage, a place to keep cured meats and sacks of grain away from the heat of the kitchen. But Edwin had cleared it out with a grumble, deciding that the detached bunkhouse was too dilapidated even for a hired hand. He would not spend the money to patch the bunkhouse roof. So Cole Ryder was moved into the lean-to. This arrangement changed the architecture of Lila's life. Before, the house had been a fortress of silence shared only with Edwin. Now, there was a third presence, separated from her pantry by nothing more than a single layer of pine boards and a narrow, drafty hallway. The proximity was suffocating. When she stood in the kitchen kneading dough in the gray light of dawn, she could hear the thud of Cole's boots as he sat on the edge of his cot. When the wind died down at night, she could hear the rhythmic rasp of his breathing, or the rustle of straw as he turned in his sleep. It made her uneasy. It made her skin prickle with a sensation she could not name, a feeling that sat somewhere between fear and a secret, shameful thrill. She found herself moving more softly in her own home, conscious of the fact that he might hear her just as she heard him. She tightened the strings of her apron and buttoned her collar to the chin, as if the thin walls had eyes. The work began before the sun had fully risen. The Wyoming winter was settling in with a grim determination, the sky turning the color of bruised iron. Edwin was a hard master, driven by the panic of his dwindling bank account and the failure of his cattle ambitions. He rode Cole hard, and he rode himself harder, desperate to wring profit from the frozen earth. Lila watched them from the kitchen window as she scraped the breakfast plates. The two men were silhouettes against the snow-dusted plains, riding out to the north pasture where the wind had knocked down a section of split-rail fence. The landscape was vast and indifferent, a rolling ocean of brown grass and white drifts that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was a country that did not care if a man lived or died, and that indifference seemed to seep into the bones of everyone who lived there. Cole worked with a quiet, efficient economy. He did not waste motion. Lila saw him dismount and take the heavy sledgehammer from his saddlebag, driving new posts into the ground that was frozen nearly as hard as stone. Edwin stood nearby, gesturing sharply, pointing out flaws, his breath puffing in angry clouds. Cole never argued. He simply nodded, adjusted his grip, and swung the hammer again. The days fell into a brutal rhythm. Mornings were for the store, where Lila measured out flour and sugar for the few townspeople who braved the cold. Afternoons were for chores. Evenings were a tense tableau in the kitchen. Edwin insisted that Cole eat his meals on the back porch, regardless of the temperature. But when the mercury dropped to 10 degrees, even Edwin's miserly cruelty had its limits. He allowed Cole to sit on a stool near the back door, eating from a tin plate while Edwin and Lila sat at the main table in silence. Lila began to notice things. She noticed that, when Cole returned in the evening, his shoulders were stiff, his slight limp more pronounced as the cold gnawed at his old injuries. Yet, he never complained. And she noticed something else, something that made her chest ache in a way she did not understand. One evening, she went to the barn to fetch eggs. The stable boy, a scrawny 12-year-old named Toby who lived with his aunt in town, was struggling to lift a heavy saddle onto a peg. Edwin would have cuffed the boy for his weakness or shouted at him to put his back into it. Lila paused in the shadows of the doorway. Cole was there, brushing down his horse, a roan gelding that looked as road-weary as its master. Cole stopped when he saw Toby struggling. He did not take the saddle from the boy. Instead, he walked over and placed a hand under the cantle, taking just enough of the weight to make it manageable. "Lift with your legs." "Toby," Cole said softly. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the sharpness that Lila was used to hearing from men. "Save your back. You will need it when you are an old man like me." Toby grinned, heaving the saddle onto the peg. "You are not old. Mr. Cole, old enough to know that a back is easier to break than to fix." Cole replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, whittled piece of wood. "Here, I finished that horse for you." Toby's eyes went wide as he took the carving. It was a crude but spirited likeness of a galloping Mustang. "Thanks." "Cole, go on home," Cole said, patting the boy's shoulder. "The stew is waiting, and the wind is picking up." Lila stepped back into the shadows, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had never seen a man show such casual kindness. Edwin's kindness was always a transaction, a public performance meant to buy reputation. Cole's kindness was quiet, hidden in a drafty barn with only a horse and a boy to witness it. It made him dangerous, a cruel man she could understand, a cruel man she could navigate. A gentleman was a landscape she had no map for. 2 days later, the opportunity for words finally came. Edwin had gone into town to argue with the blacksmith about a bill, leaving Cole to finish mending the harnesses in the tack room of the barn. It was bitter cold, the kind of cold that made the air feel thin and brittle. Lila brewed a fresh pot of coffee, telling herself it was simply her duty as the lady of the house to keep the hired help from freezing. She poured a mug, wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders, and crossed the wind-scoured yard. The barn was dim and smelled of hay and leather. Cole was sitting on a crate, a bridle in his lap, working a leather punch through a stubborn strap. He looked up when she entered, his eyes narrowing slightly as they adjusted to the light from the open door. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, starting to rise. "Please, sit," Lila said quickly. She held out the steaming mug. "I brought you this. It is cold work." Cole hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes searching hers, before he reached out and took the cup. His fingers were rough, stained with oil and dirt, and for a moment they brushed against hers. His skin was cold, but the touch sent a jolt of heat through her arm that nearly made her drop the mug. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, cradling the cup in both hands to steal its warmth. "This is kind of you. It is just coffee," she said, hugging her arms across her chest. "It is more than that," he murmured. He took a sip and sighed, a long exhale that seemed to carry the weight of the day. "The winter is settling in hard. I have not seen a sky this gray since I was in the Dakotas." "You have traveled far, then?" Lila asked. She remained standing near the door, ready to bolt if Edwin appeared, but unable to tear herself away. "Far enough," Cole said. He looked down at the coffee, swirling the black liquid. "I have seen the Dakotas, and Texas, and the territories in between. There's a lot of empty country out there. It must be lonely, she said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Cole looked up at her then. His face was shadowed, the scar on his jaw a pale line against the stubble. It can be, but sometimes the quiet is better than the noise. What kind of noise? The noise of men. He said, the noise of trouble. He took another sip, and his gaze drifted past her, focused on something she could not see. I was on a drive 2 years ago. Up from the Panhandle, we hit a river crossing when the water was high. The boss was in a hurry. He wanted to beat the prices in Dodge City. He pushed the herd into the water before we were ready. Lila watched him, sensing the shift in the air. The barn felt suddenly smaller, intimate. What happened? We lost 300 head, Cole said, his voice flat. And 2 good men. One of them was a boy, no older than Toby. I tried to grab him. I had a hold of his shirt. But the current was stronger. He stopped. He did not look at her. His hand gripped the mug so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Lila saw the guilt etched into the lines of his face, a raw, open wound that had never healed. He was a man who carried ghosts. I am sorry, she whispered. Cole shrugged. A stiff, painful motion. It was a long time ago. But the water, you do not forget the sound of it. Lila took a step closer, drawn by an instinct she had suppressed for years. She recognized that look. It was the same look she saw in the mirror when she remembered the wagon accident, the sound of splintering wood, and her mother's scream. You blame yourself, she said softly. A man is responsible for the men beside him, Cole said. That is the code. Even when the river is too high, even when the boss is wrong. Especially then. He looked at her again, and this time, his gaze was piercing. He looked at the fading yellow bruise on her wrist, where Edwin had squeezed her 3 days ago for forgetting to salt the stew. Her sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing the mark. Cole's eyes lingered on the bruise, and his expression hardened. The sadness vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. You carry your own burdens, Mrs. Mercer, he said quietly. Lila instinctively pulled her sleeve down, her heart racing. I am clumsy. I bumped into the doorframe. Cole did not pretend to believe her. He did not nod. He simply held her gaze. And in his eyes, she saw that he knew. He knew about Edwin. He knew about the fear that lived in the house. And he did not look at her with pity, which she would have hated. He looked at her with a profound, simmering recognition. Doorways can be dangerous things, he said, his voice laced with a double meaning she could not miss. You should be careful. I am always careful, she said, her voice trembling. Just then, the sound of wagon wheels crunched on the frozen mud outside. Edwin was back. The spell broke instantly. Lila stepped back, her face draining of color. Cole stood up, setting the mug on the crate. He resumed his posture of the hired hand, shoulders slumped, head down. Invisible. Go, he said softly. Lila turned and fled back to the house, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She washed the coffee pot with shaking hands, the memory of his eyes burning into her mind. He had seen her. He had seen the bruise, and he had not looked away. Edwin entered the kitchen a moment later, stamping the mud from his boots. He was in a foul mood. The blacksmith had refused to lower his price. He threw his hat on the table and glared at Lila. Where's the coffee? He demanded. I just finished the pot. Lila lied, praying her voice would hold steady. I was about to make more. Edwin narrowed his eyes. He sniffed the air. He looked at the empty pot, then at the back door. I saw footprints in the snow, he said slowly. Leading to the barn. Lila froze. I went to get eggs. Edwin walked over to her. He did not touch her, but he loomed, his presence a dark cloud. He leaned in close, smelling of cold air and stale anger. You are a God-fearing woman. Lila, he said. A woman of virtue. Yes, Edwin. And Ryder. He is a hand, a drifter. He is here to work, not to socialize. I was not socializing. Edwin. Edwin's face was inches from hers. "The Bible says that a foolish woman is clamorous. She is simple and knows nothing." "Do not be foolish. Lila, do not let your tongue wag with the hired help. It does not look right, and I will not have my reputation stained by idle chatter." "I understand," she whispered. He stared at her for a moment longer, then turned away. "Make the coffee, and make it strong." That night, the snow began. It started as a few drifting flakes, innocent and soft. But by midnight, the wind had turned it into a weapon. The blizzard slammed into Silver Creek with the fury of a biblical plague. For 3 days, the world ceased to exist beyond the walls of the house and the barn. The white curtain came down, obliterating the mountains, the road, and the sky. The isolation was absolute. The cattle huddled in the lee of the ravines, and the few that had not been brought in drifted with the wind until they froze standing up. Cole and Edwin were forced to work shoulder to shoulder, battling the elements to keep the livestock in the barn alive. They ran lines of rope between the house and the outbuildings so they wouldn't lose their way in the whiteout. Inside the house, the tension grew thick as smoke. Edwin drank. It was a secret vice he usually kept hidden, but the storm and the financial terror gnawing at him broke his restraint. He sat by the parlor stove, a bottle of whiskey on the floor beside him, muttering about the cattle, about the bank, about the unfairness of God. Lila moved like a ghost, keeping the fire fed, keeping out of his reach. On the third night, the temperature plummeted. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the very foundation of the house. Edwin had passed out in the armchair, his head lolling back, his mouth open, snoring with a wet, ragged sound. The fire in the parlor was dying down. Lila lay in her bed, shivering. The cold was profound. She thought of the lean-to. The walls there were thin, the insulation non-existent. Cole had no stove in that room. He had only the blankets on his cot. She tried to close her eyes, to sleep, but the image of him freezing on the other side of the wall would not leave her. She thought of his hands, cracked from the cold. She thought of the way he had looked at her bruise. She sat up, her breath plumed in the dark. She did not let herself think about the morality of it. She simply acted. She went to the linen chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out 2 heavy wool quilts. She wrapped her shawl around her nightdress and crept into the hallway. The floorboards groaned under her feet, but the howling wind masked the sound. She passed the parlor where Edwin slept the sleep of the drunk and moved to the back of the house. She opened the door to the lean-to. A blast of freezing air hit her. The room was dark, lit only by the faint gray luminescence of the snow pressing against the single small window. "Cole?" she whispered. There was a rustle of straw. "Who is there?" His voice was sharp. Awake instantly. "It is Lila." He sat up. She could see the outline of his form on the narrow cot. He was shivering. "Mrs. Mercer, what is wrong? Is it Edwin?" "No," she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her to keep the draft out of the main house. She clutched the quilts to her chest. "It is the cold. I thought you might freeze." She moved toward him and held out the blankets. Cole did not take them immediately. He sat still, staring at her in the gloom. "You shouldn't be here. Lila, I know," she whispered, "but I could not sleep knowing you were cold." He reached out and took the heavy wool. His hand brushed hers, and again, that shock of awareness passed between them. He pulled the quilts onto the bed, wrapping them around his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. It is bad out there. The storm is fierce." She agreed. She did not leave. She stood in the dark, her back against the door. The cold of the room was biting, but the air between them felt charged, heavy. "Why do you stay?" Cole asked suddenly. Lila blinked. "Stay? With him? With this life?" She wrapped her arms around herself. "I have nowhere else to go. He is my husband. He took me in when I had nothing." "That is a debt," Cole said. "Not a marriage. It is what I have." Cole was silent for a moment. She could hear him breathing, the sound distinct over the wind outside. "You are afraid of him," he stated. "He is a hard man. The world has been hard on him." "That is no excuse," Cole said. "The world is hard on everyone. It does not give a man the right to bruise the things he is supposed to protect." Lila flinched in the dark. He does not mean to. He means to control you," Cole said. "He keeps you small. He keeps you quiet. I've seen horses broken like that. It takes the spirit out of them. I am not a horse." "Cole." "No," he said softly. "You are not. You are a woman who deserves better than to flinch when a door slams." Lila felt tears prick her eyes. The truth of his words cut her deeper than the cold. She had spent years convincing herself that her life was normal, that her unhappiness was a sin of ingratitude. Hearing him name it, naming the fear, naming the cruelty, shattered her defense. "I do not know any other way," she confessed, her voice cracking. "There are other ways," Cole said. "There are places where the wind does not blow like this, places where a woman can sing without being told to hush." Lila took a step toward the cot. "Do not," she whispered. "Do not give me hope. It is cruel. Is it cruel to tell the truth?" "Yes," she said. "When the truth changes nothing." Cole stood up. The quilts fell away from his shoulders. He was fully dressed, save for his boots. Having slept in his clothes for warmth, he moved toward her in the darkness. He stopped only a foot away. She could feel the heat radiating from him. "It changes everything," he said. "Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You are alive. Lila, you are not just a fixture in his store." "I am tired of being afraid," she admitted, the words tumbling out. "I am so tired." "Cole." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. He did not touch her. Not yet. His hesitation was a tangible thing, a war between his honor and his hunger. "You deserve tenderness." Lila. The word hung in the air. Tenderness. It was a word she had starved for. She looked up at him, her eyes adjusting to the dark, seeing the intensity in his gaze. Without thinking, she leaned into his hand. His palm cupped her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused from the reins and the hammer, but his touch was impossibly gentle. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped. Lila trembled. The sensation was overwhelming. It was not just comfort, it was fire. It was a sudden, violent realization of how lonely her body had been. "Cole." She breathed. He leaned closer. His forehead touched hers. She could smell the tobacco and the clean scent of snow on him. They stood there, suspended in the dark, the storm raging outside, their breathing sinking into a frantic rhythm. For a moment, she thought he would kiss her. She wanted him to. She wanted him to burn down the careful, gray prison she had built. But then the floorboard in the hallway creaked. It was just the house settling in the cold. But the sound was like a gunshot. They sprang apart. Lila gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Cole stepped back, his fists clenching at his sides. The reality of what they were doing crashed down on them. Adultery, sin, danger. If Edwin walked through that door, there would be blood. "Go," Cole rasped, his voice strained. "Before I do something that will get us both killed." Lila did not argue. She turned and slipped out the door, closing it softly behind her. She hurried down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the wood, past the parlor where Edwin still snored, oblivious to the fact that his world was beginning to fracture. She climbed back into her cold bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. She lay there, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the wall that separated her room from the lean-to. She pressed her hand against the plaster. On the other side, she heard the faint creak of the cot as Cole sat down. She heard him sigh, a sound of frustration and longing. They were separated by 6 inches of wood and plaster, but the distance felt infinite and yet non-existent. Lila closed her eyes, her cheek burning where he had touched her. She listened to the storm, but all she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears, singing a song of forbidden things. She was terrified. She was ashamed, but God help her, she was alive. Spring arrived in Wyoming not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent upheaval of the earth. The snow, which had buried Silver Creek in silence for 4 long months, did not melt gracefully. It collapsed into a slush of gray ice and brown water that turned the plains into a sucking quagmire. The roads became impassable rivers of mud that could swallow a wagon wheel to the axle, and the air hung heavy with the smell of wet wool, damp rot, and the thawing earth. It was a season of reckoning. As the drifts receded, they revealed the cost of the winter. On the Mercer Ranch, the melting snow uncovered the stiff, bloated carcasses of cattle that had huddled together in the ravines and frozen where they stood. They lay like dark stones in the pastures, their legs jutting stiffly into the air, a feast for the coyotes and the buzzards that circled in the pale, watery sky. For Edwin Mercer, the thaw was a revelation of ruin. He spent his days riding the fence lines with Cole, counting the dead. Every carcass was a blow to his pride and a hole in his ledger. He calculated the lost profits in muttering tones, his face growing darker and more granite-like with each discovery. The financial strain, which had been a dull ache in the autumn, was now a sharp, throbbing pain. The bank in Cheyenne had sent a letter, carried by the first mail coach to break through the mud, inquiring about the repayment of a loan Edwin had taken to expand the herd, a herd that was now decimated. The stress turned Edwin volatile. His silence, previously just cold, became a loaded weapon. He moved through the house with a coiled tension, looking for faults, for someone to blame for the weather and the market and the God who seemed to have turned his back on the mercantile business. He found his targets in Lila and Cole. The work was brutal. The dead cattle had to be dragged away and burned or buried before they fouled the water table. Cole worked from dawn until long after dusk, his boots caked with pounds of mud, his hands raw and blistered from the rope and the shovel. He did the work of 3 men, driving himself with a stoic determination. But nothing he did was enough for Edwin. "You are moving too slow, Ryder," Edwin would snap, watching from the dry safety of the porch as Cole struggled to hitch a team of horses to a carcass. "Daylight is burning, and you are plodding like an old mule. The mud is deep." "Mr. Mercer," Cole would reply, his voice even, though his jaw was set hard. "The horses can only pull so much. Do not give me excuses," Edwin would retort. "I pay you for labor, not for complaints. If you cannot handle the stock, I will find a man who can." It was a hollow threat. No one else was hiring, and certainly no one else would do the grim work of corpse clearing for the pittance Edwin paid. But the insults chipped away at the air, leaving a residue of bitterness. Inside the house, Lila bore the brunt of Edwin's indoor fury. The mud tracked in on boots was a constant sin. The dampness that made the flour clump in the barrel was her personal failing. She scrubbed the floors until her knees were bruised and her hands were red and cracked. But the dirt always returned. And with it, Edwin's scorn. One Tuesday morning, the tension finally snapped. Lila was in the storeroom, moving a 50-pound sack of flour from the delivery pallet to the bin. It was heavy work, meant for a man. But Edwin was busy with a customer, and Cole was out in the south pasture. She dragged the sack across the floor, her breath coming in short gasps. As she tried to lift it onto the lip of the bin, her foot slipped on a patch of damp floorboards. She stumbled. The sack tipped, hitting the edge of the wood. The burlap tore with a sickening rip, and white flour exploded across the floor, coating Lila's skirt and the polished wood in a drift of snowy powder. Lila froze, her heart stopping in her chest. The bell above the door jingled as the customer left. Then there was silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Edwin appeared in the doorway of the storeroom. He looked at the spilled flour. He looked at the torn sack. Then he looked at Lila. His face went a mottled red. "You clumsy, useless woman," he hissed. "I am sorry." "Edwin," Lila stammered, dropping to her knees and trying to scoop the flour back into the tear with her hands. "I slipped. The floor was wet." "Waste," Edwin roared. Stepping into the room, he kicked the sack, sending another puff of white dust into the air. "Do you know what flour costs? Do you know what freight costs? You treat my money like it is dirt to be swept away." "I will pay for it," Lila cried, though she had no money of her own. I will mend the sack. You will pay for it with what? Edwin shouted. He reached down and grabbed her by the upper arm, hauling her to her feet with a violence that made her head snap back. You have nothing but what I give you. You are a drain. Lila. A millstone around my neck. He shook her, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of her arm. Lila cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound of pain. Suddenly, the back door of the store opened. A draft of cold air cut through the room. Take your hands off her. The voice was not loud. It was low, calm, and terrifyingly flat. Edwin froze. He turned his head to see Cole standing in the doorway. Cole was covered in mud, his duster heavy with it, his hat dripping rainwater, but his eyes were clear, and they were fixed on Edwin's hand gripping Lila's arm. Edwin sneered, though he did not let go. This is a private matter, Ryder, between a man and his wife. Get back to the barn, I said. Take your hands off her, Cole repeated. He took a step into the room. He did not reach for the gun at his hip. He did not have to. The threat was in his posture, in the way he held his shoulders square, in the lethal stillness of his hands. Edwin hesitated. He looked at Cole, gauging the distance and the danger. He saw something in the hired hand's eyes that he had not seen before, a line that had been drawn in the sand, slowly, deliberately. Edwin released Lila. He shoved her slightly away from him, dusting his hands as if he had touched something unclean. She spilled a sack of flour. Edwin said, his voice regaining its bluster but losing its volume. Profits are thin enough without her clumsiness. Accidents happen. Cole said. He looked at Lila. His gaze touched her face, checking for bruises, then moved to her arm. Are you all right, ma'am? Lila nodded, clutching her arm where Edwin's fingers had left red marks that would surely turn blue by evening. Yes, she whispered. I'm fine, Mr. Cole. Edwin straightened his coat. He looked from Cole to Lila, and his eyes went cold. It was a look of calculation. He realized in that moment that his authority was being challenged, not by words, but by the sheer presence of another male force in his house. You are getting above your station. Ryder, Edwin said softly, do not forget who signs your pay. I do not forget, Cole said, but I will not stand by and watch you hurt a woman over a sack of dust. Edwin's lip curled. Get out. Go fix the corral gate. If it is not done by supper, do not bother coming to the kitchen for a plate. Cole held Edwin's gaze for a second longer, a second that stretched out into an eternity of defiance, before he turned and walked back out into the rain. Lila stood trembling in the storeroom, the flour settling around her like ash. Edwin turned to her. Clean this up, he said, his voice devoid of emotion now. Every grain, and stay away from him. Lila, I mean it. That man is a snake, and if you let him in, you will be the one who gets bit. After that day, the dynamic in the house shifted. It was no longer just a marriage of convenience and cruelty. It was a siege. Edwin watched them. He watched from the window when Lila hung laundry on the line. He watched when she went to the well. He was waiting for a slip, for a sign, for justification. But Lila could not stop herself. The incident in the storeroom had broken something in her fear. Cole had stood up for her. No one had ever stood up for her, not since her father died. That single act of protection had planted a seed of devotion in her chest that was growing roots deep into her soul. She began to seek moments of refuge. She would volunteer to hang the sheets on the line even when the wind was biting, just because it gave her a view of the corral where Cole was breaking a new horse. She would linger by the water trough, resting her hand on the warm, velvet nose of the stable pony. Watching Cole work in the distance, she needed to be near him. It was a physical hunger. The house felt like a coffin. The open air, where Cole was, felt like the only place she could breathe. One afternoon, late in April, the air turned heavy and green. A spring storm was brewing, the kind that rolled off the mountains with thunder and hail. The wind had died down to an eerie stillness. Lila went to the barn to fetch the milk pail she had left there that morning. The barn was dim, smelling of sweet hay and horse sweat. It was warm compared to the outside air. Cole was there, pitching hay into the loft. He was shirtless, despite the chill, his skin glistening with sweat. Lila stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. She had never seen him without his heavy duster and shirt. He was scarred, not just on his face, but on his torso. There were puckered marks on his shoulder and a long, white slash across his ribs. But beneath the scars, he was lean and powerful, his muscles moving like cords of rope under his skin as he worked the pitchfork. He sensed her presence and stopped, turning to face her. He did not reach for his shirt. He simply leaned on the handle of the fork, his chest heaving slightly. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. Lila swallowed hard. I came for the pail. It is over by the grain bin," he said. She walked toward the bin, her eyes averted, her cheeks burning. The air in the barn felt suddenly thick, charged with the electricity of the coming storm and the heat of his body. She grabbed the pail and turned to leave, walking quickly. She was not looking where she was going. Her boot caught on a loose floorboard, the same board she had asked Edwin to fix 3 times in the last month. She pitched forward with a gasp, the pail flying from her hand. She braced herself for the impact of the hard-packed dirt floor, but it never came. Strong arms caught her. Cole had moved with the speed of a striking snake. He caught her around the waist, hauling her up against him to keep her from falling. The momentum spun them slightly, and suddenly she was pressed flat against his bare chest. She gasped, her hands instinctively clutching his shoulders to steady herself. His skin was hot, damp with sweat. Hard as iron, she could feel the rapid thud of his heart against her palm. She could smell him, the scent of hay, the salt of his skin, the tobacco, and the underlying masculine scent that was uniquely him. For a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, neither of them moved. Cole's arms were locked around her waist, holding her tight against him. His face was inches from hers. She looked up, her lips parted in shock, and locked eyes with him. His eyes were dark, dilated, burning with a raw, terrifying hunger. It was the look of a man who had been starving for a lifetime and suddenly found a feast set before him. Lila felt a jolt of desire so potent it made her knees weak. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just safety. It was want. She wanted to press closer. She wanted to taste the salt on his skin. She wanted his arms to never let go. The silence of the barn screamed with the things they were not saying. "Take me, save me, love me." Then, reality crashed back in. Lila pulled away, stumbling back, her hands flying to her chest. I am sorry," she stammered, her voice high and breathless. "I tripped. The board." Cole stood there, his arms still half raised as if he could not quite believe she was gone. His fists clenched at his sides, the muscles in his jaw jumping. He looked like a man in pain. "Careful, Lila," he rasped, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. "You have to be careful. I know," she whispered. Thank you." She grabbed the pail from the dirt and fled. She ran across the yard, the first heavy drops of rain beginning to fall, hitting her face like cold tears. She did not stop until she was inside the kitchen. The door bolted behind her. She leaned against the wood, sliding down until she hit the floor, burying her face in her apron. Her whole body was shaking. She could still feel the heat of his skin on her palms. That evening, the storm broke in earnest. It was a violent, thrashing thing. Thunder shook the foundations of the house, rattling the china in the cupboard. Rain lashed against the windows like handfuls of gravel. Edwin was in a foul mood. He had received news that the price of beef had dropped again in Chicago. He sat at the kitchen table, a bottle of rye whiskey in front of him, drinking with a grim, mechanical determination. He ranted. He ranted about the weather. He ranted about the government. He ranted about the ungratefulness of women who ate a man's food and offered nothing but sour looks in return. Lila moved silently, clearing the table, trying to make herself invisible, but there was no hiding from him tonight. "You are quiet," he sneered, pouring another glass. "Quiet as a mouse. But mice steal cheese, don't they? I'm just tired. Edwin, Tired. He laughed, a bitter sound. You do not know what tired is. Tired is working a ranch that is trying to kill you. Tired is paying a cripple to do work I could do myself if I had the time. He is a good worker, Lila said quietly. He is a leech, Edwin spat, and do not think I do not see the way you look at him. Lila froze. I do not look at him. Do not lie to me. Edwin slammed his hand on the table. I see it, the way you soften when he walks in, the way you rush to bring him coffee. You are a married woman. Lila, you belong to me. He stood up, swaying slightly. He walked over to her and grabbed her face in his hand, squeezing her cheeks until her lips puckered. Remember your vows, he hissed. To obey. That is the word you forget. He released her with a shove and stumbled toward the bedroom. I am going to bed. Do not wake me with your pacing. He slammed the bedroom door. Lila stood in the kitchen, listening. 10 minutes later, she heard the heavy, wet snoring that signaled he had passed out. She could not stay in there. She could not go into that bedroom and lie down beside the man who looked at her with such hate. The air in the house felt stifling, poisonous. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. The wind was howling outside, a cacophony that masked all other sounds. She walked into the hallway. She did not intend to go to the lean-to. She told herself she was just pacing, but her feet knew where to go. They carried her to the end of the hall, to the thin door that separated her world from his. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. The memory of his chest against hers in the barn burned in her mind. She pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by a small kerosene lamp burning low on a crate. Cole was not asleep. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, still fully dressed, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He looked up when the door opened. He did not look surprised. He looked resigned. Lila, he whispered. I could not sleep. She said, her voice was barely audible over the storm. Edwin, he is drunk? Cole finished. Yes. She stepped inside and closed the door. The room was cold, but it smelled of him, and that was enough to make her feel safe. Cole shifted on the cot, making space. Sit. She sat on the edge of the bunk, leaving a foot of distance between them. They stared at the wall, at the rough grain of the wood. The storm battered the house, isolating them in this small, flickering bubble of light. He is getting worse, Lila said. The anger. It is eating him. He is a small man facing a big world, Cole said. That makes for a dangerous kind of fear. Are you afraid? She asked. Cole looked at his hands. They were scarred, the knuckles swollen from work. I have been afraid most of my life. Lila, fear keeps you alive. It is when you stop being afraid that you make mistakes. She looked at his profile. The scar on his jaw seemed deeper in the lamplight. You said you had seen trouble, that you carried ghosts. Cole was silent for a long time. The wind whistled through a crack in the siding. I have killed men, he said. Lila did not flinch. She had suspected it. The way he moved, the way he watched the door. Those were the habits of a man who had lived by the gun. Why? She asked. Never for pleasure, he said quietly, and never for money. But on the trail, in the camps, things go wrong. Liquor, cards, pride. A man draws on you, and you have a split second to decide if you want to be the one who rides away or the one who stays in the dirt. He looked at her, his eyes full of a haunted darkness. I chose to ride away. 3 times. I see their faces when I sleep. They were not good men, mostly, but they were men. They had mothers. Maybe they had wives. He rubbed his face with his hands. That is why I drift. Lila, the ghosts do not follow you as close if you keep moving. Lila felt a surge of empathy so strong it hurt. He was not a monster. He was a survivor, just like her. I have ghosts too, she whispered. Cole turned to her. You? The ghost of the girl I was supposed to be, she said. Before the wagon turned over, before I became this, she gestured to herself, to the faded dress, the red hands. I am 24 years old, Cole, and I feel like I have been dead for 5 years. I walk through this house, and I am invisible. I cook, I clean, I serve, but no one sees me. I am just a tool, a piece of furniture that Edwin bought to keep his house warm." Her voice cracked, tears spilling over her lashes. "I am so lonely, Cole. I am so lonely, I think I might disappear." The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. Cole looked at her. He saw the tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. He saw the trembling of her mouth. Instinctively, without thinking about the consequences, he reached out. His hand cupped her face. His thumb brushed away a tear, his skin rough against her softness. Lila leaned into his touch. She closed her eyes, a soft sound escaping her throat. It was a sound of relief, of surrender. "Cole," she whispered. His hand trembled against her skin. He could feel the pulse jumping in her jaw. He knew he should pull away. He knew that touching her like this was a violation of every code he had ever lived by. You did not touch another man's wife. You did not covet. But looking at her, seeing the desperate need in her eyes, the code turned to ash. Lila opened her eyes. They were wet, shining in the lamplight, fixed on his mouth. "My husband is in the next room," she whispered. The words were a warning. They were a reminder of the danger, of the sin. But the way she said them, breathless, terrified, hopeful, made them sound like an invitation. "Then let's stay quiet," Cole murmured. He leaned in. Lila did not pull away. She tilted her head up. Their foreheads touched, resting against each other. They breathed the same air. Lila could feel the warmth of his breath on her lips. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, beating in time with his. The attraction was a physical weight, pressing them together. It would be so easy. Just 1 inch, just one movement, and she would be in his arms, and the cold and the loneliness would be gone. Cole's hand slid into the hair at the nape of her neck. His fingers tightened. He was on the precipice. But the sound of the storm outside shifted. A branch snapped against the window with a violent crack. The noise shattered the trance. Lila gasped, pulling back as if she had been burned. She stared at him, her eyes wide with horror and desire. She realized how close she had come. She had been seconds away from destroying her life. I cannot," she stammered. "Lila," Cole said, his voice ragged. "I cannot." She scrambled off the bed. She backed away toward the door, her chest heaving. Cole sat there, his hand still raised in the air, looking at her with an expression of utter devastation. She turned and fumbled with the latch. She threw the door open and ran into the dark hallway. She did not look back. She fled to her room, to the cold, empty side of the bed next to her snoring husband. She lay down, pulling the quilt over her head, shivering violently. She pressed her fingers to her lips. They were tingling. She lay there in the dark, listening to the wind, and she knew that she had lied. She could have done it. She had wanted to do it, and that want was more terrifying than any storm. The days that followed the storm were a torture of silence. The air in the Mercer house, once merely cold, had become heavy and charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. The near embrace in the lean-to had stripped away the pretense of indifference between Lila and Cole. They could no longer pretend to be strangers, nor could they pretend to be merely the mistress of the house and the hired hand. Every interaction became a minefield. When Lila passed the platter of biscuits to Cole at the back door, Edwin still refusing to let him eat at the table, their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. The contact sent a shock through Lila that made her breath hitch, and she saw Cole's jaw tighten, his eyes darkening with a suppressed flare of heat. They moved around each other with agonizing care. In the barn, if Lila entered, Cole would move to the far end. In the kitchen, if Cole came in for water, Lila would busy herself at the stove, her back rigid, but the eyes of the town were not blind. Silver Creek was a place where boredom bred observation, and observation bred gossip. The storm had trapped everyone indoors, but as the mud began to dry into ruts hard enough to break a wheel spoke, the townspeople emerged with a hunger for news. It began with whispers. Mrs. Miller mentioned to the postmaster that she had seen the Mercer hired hand chopping wood for the kitchen stove while Lila watched from the porch. and that there was a look about them. By Sunday, the whisper had become a murmur. Lila felt it the moment she walked into the church. She wore her best gray wool dress, her bonnet pulled low, walking 2 paces behind Edwin as was proper. But as they moved down the aisle to their pew, heads turned. The rustle of hymnals stopped. Mrs. Gable, seated in the front row, adjusted her shawl with a sharp snap and leaned over to whisper something to her neighbor, her eyes darting toward Lila. Reverend Thomas seemed to sense the current in the room. He was a gaunt man with eyes that seemed to see sin in the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. He gripped the pulpit with bony hands, his voice booming off the rafters. "The heart is a deceitful thing," he thundered, his gaze sweeping the congregation. "It covets what it does not own. It looks upon the neighbor's field, the neighbor's goods, the neighbor's wife, and it whispers lies. And I tell you, brothers and sisters, the adulterous heart is a rot. It starts small, a glance, a thought, a moment of weakness, but it spreads like gangrene until the soul is black and dead." Lila sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap until her knuckles turned white. She felt as though the Reverend were speaking directly to her, as though he had peered through the walls of the lean-to and seen her forehead resting against coals. Beside her, Edwin nodded vigorously, murmuring an amen that sounded more like a judgment than a prayer. He did not look at her, but she felt his disapproval radiating like heat from a stove. The pressure mounted not just from the pulpit, but from the ledger. The winter had been ruinous. The loss of the cattle was a financial wound that refused to clot. Edwin grew more desperate with each passing day. He stopped sleeping. He paced the floorboards at night, the creaking wood a torment to Lila, who lay awake staring at the ceiling. Then came Mr. Harrow. Cyrus Harrow was a man who owned half the valley and held mortgages on the other half. He was a cattle baron of the new breed, a businessman who wore silk vests and smoked cigars that smelled of money and cruelty. He rode out to the Mercer Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, accompanied by 2 silent men on large bay horses. Edwin met him in the parlor. Lila was ordered to bring coffee and then make herself scarce. She lingered in the hallway, polishing the same spot on the side table for 10 minutes, straining to hear. "The bank is not patient, Edwin." Harrow's voice drifted out, smooth and oily. "And neither am I. You are overextended. That herd you lost was your collateral." "I can rebuild," Edwin pleaded, his voice thin and high. "I just need time. The spring grass is coming in. Grass does not pay interest," Harrow said. "I am willing to buy you out. The land, the house, the stock, all of it." "Buy me out?" Edwin sounded horrified. "This is my legacy." "Harrow, it is a failing investment," Harrow corrected. "I will give you $500, enough to move to the city, start fresh. Maybe open a small shop where the work is not so hard on your constitution." "500. It is worth 2,000. Not without cattle." "It is not." Harrow paused, and Lila could hear the click of a teacup being set down. "Of course, there are other arrangements. I could hold the note for another year, but the terms would change." "Change how?" "Interest at 20%, Harrow said. "And I would require a guarantee, a lien on the property, and perhaps some personal assurances." "Assurances? You have a lovely wife, Edwin, a woman of quality. It is a shame to see her working like a drudge in this dust. If we were partners, I would expect to visit more often, to inspect my investment. I would expect hospitality, warm hospitality." There was a silence, a long, sickening silence. Lila felt the blood drain from her face. Harrow was not talking about coffee and cake. He was suggesting something ancient and vile, wrapped in the language of business. Edwin did not shout. He did not throw Harrow out. He simply cleared his throat. I will consider the terms, Mr. Harrow." Lila fled to the kitchen, her stomach churning. Edwin had not defended her. He had not been outraged. He had weighed her honor against his debt, and he had hesitated. That night, the explosion finally came. Edwin had been drinking since Harrow left. He sat at the kitchen table, the bottle of whiskey nearly empty. His eyes were red-rimmed and unfocused. When Lila came in to start supper, moving quietly, he watched her with a mixture of loathing and possession. "What did you hear?" he demanded suddenly. Lila froze, a potato in her hand. "I beg your pardon?" "Today, with Harrow, I know you were listening. You are always listening, creeping around like a cat." "I heard enough," Lila said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I heard him insult you, and I heard him insult me." Edwin stood up, the chair scraping violently against the floor. "He insulted no one. He is a businessman. He offered us a way out." A way out? Lila turned to face him, her fear momentarily eclipsed by indignation. "By selling me? By letting him into this house to inspect his investment?" Edwin crossed the room in 2 strides. "You watch your tongue, woman. You do not understand the weight I carry. I do this for us, for food in your belly." "You do it for your pride," Lila cried out. "You would trade your wife to save your name." The slap came out of nowhere. It was a backhanded blow, loose and heavy. It caught Lila across the cheekbone with a cracking sound that echoed in the small kitchen. The force of it knocked her backward. She stumbled, her hip hitting the edge of the counter, and she fell to the floor with a cry of pain and shock. She put a hand to her face. Her skin burned as if it had been branded. She looked up at Edwin, expecting to see regret. Instead, she saw a terrifying satisfaction. He looked like a man who had finally exerted control over his chaotic world. "You will learn your place." "Lila!" he snarled, standing over her. Suddenly, the back door crashed open. It slammed against the wall with such force that the glass pane in the upper window shattered, raining shards onto the floor. Cole stood in the doorway. He was not the quiet hired hand anymore. He was a storm. His face was pale with rage, his eyes black and lethal. He had heard the blow through the thin walls of the lean-to, the sound of flesh striking flesh, and Lila's cry, and it had snapped the last thread of his restraint. Cole stepped into the kitchen, crunching over the glass. He did not look at Lila. His eyes were locked on Edwin. His hands were curled into fists at his sides, the knuckles white as bone. "Get away from her," Cole said. The voice was a low growl, vibrating with the promise of violence. Edwin spun around, startled. He saw Cole and stepped back, his false courage faltering. "This is my house. Ryder, get out!" Cole did not stop. He walked straight up to Edwin. He was taller, broader, and infinitely more dangerous. He grabbed Edwin by the lapels of his coat and shoved him backward. Edwin's legs hit the chair, and he went down hard, scrambling to keep his footing. "You touch her again," Cole whispered, standing over him, "and I will kill you. I will not shoot you. I will tear you apart with my bare hands." "I am the master here," Edwin shrieked, scrabbling on the floor, looking around for a weapon. "He is threatening me, the law." "To hell with the law," Cole roared. He raised a fist, ready to strike, ready to smash the face of the man who had tormented Lila for years. "No!" Lila scrambled up from the floor. She threw herself between them, grabbing Cole's arm. He was rigid as stone, his muscles trembling with the effort to hold back. "Cole, no!" she begged. "Please, he is not worth it. They will hang you." Cole looked down at her. He saw the red mark blooming on her cheek, the fear in her eyes. The sight of her injury almost made him lose control again, but her words pierced through the red haze. "They will hang you." She was protecting him. "He will hurt you again," Cole said, his voice breaking. "I'm all right," she lied, gripping his arm with both hands. "Please, go, just go." Cole looked back at Edwin, who was cowering on the floor, clutching a piece of firewood he had managed to grab. The disgust on Cole's face was absolute. "You are a small man, Mercer." Cole spat. He turned to Lila. His eyes softened, frantic with worry. "Lock your door," he whispered. Then he turned and walked out into the night, the darkness swallowing him whole. Lila stood shivering in the kitchen. Edwin slowly climbed to his feet, dusting off his pants, his face regaining its sneer now that the threat was gone. "You see?" Edwin panted. "He is a madman, a violent animal. He is fired. Tomorrow morning, he is gone." Lila looked at her husband. She saw him clearly for the first time. He was not just cruel. He was weak, and she realized, with a sudden, crystalline clarity, that she was done being afraid of him. "He stays," Lila said. Edwin blinked. "What? He stays," she repeated, her voice steady despite the pain in her cheek. "Because if you fire him, who will fix the fences? Who will manage the herd? You cannot even lift a saddle anymore. Edwin, you need him. I do not need, and if you fire him," Lila cut in, "I will tell the town about Mr. Harrow. I will tell the preacher that you tried to sell your wife to a cattle baron. I will tell Mrs. Gable everything." Edwin's mouth opened and closed. He looked at her, stunned by her defiance. He saw the bruise on her face, the evidence of his own sin, and he knew she held a weapon he could not counter. Reputation was his god, and she had the power to topple it. He sneered, turning away to hide his defeat. "Go to your room. I do not want to look at you." Lila went, but she did not cry. She lay in her bed, touching her stinging cheek, and thought of Cole. She thought of the way he had stormed through that door. He had not hesitated. He had been ready to throw his life away for her. He was the only person in the world who saw her pain and thought it mattered. 2 days passed. The atmosphere in the house was toxic. Edwin ignored Cole, speaking only through grunts and gestures. He ignored Lila entirely. He retreated into the bottle, drinking heavily to drown the memory of his cowardice. On the 3rd night, a Friday, Edwin did not come home for supper. He had ridden into town to meet with Harrow again, or perhaps just to drink at the saloon. He returned well past midnight, his horse stumbling into the yard. He crashed into the house, knocking over a coat rack, and fell into bed fully clothed. Within minutes, the house shook with his snores. Lila lay awake. The moon was full, casting a pale, silver light across the floorboards. She listened to the rhythm of Edwin's breathing. It was the sound of her cage. She could not bear it anymore. The coldness, the cruelty, the sheer waste of her life. She thought of Cole, lying just on the other side of the wall. She thought of the way he looked at her. Her resolve, which had been holding back the floodwaters for years, finally crumbled. She sat up. She did not put on her shawl. She wore only her white cotton nightdress, her hair loose down her back. Her feet were bare on the cold wood. She walked out of the bedroom, past the form of her husband, and into the hallway. She moved like a sleepwalker, drawn by a force she could not resist. She reached the door of the lean-to. She did not hesitate this time. She raised her hand and knocked. 1, 2, 3 times. Soft as a heartbeat. There was a pause. Then the latch lifted. The door opened. Cole stood there. He was dressed in his trousers and undershirt, the suspenders hanging down. His hair was tousled from sleep, but his eyes were wide awake. He held a kerosene lamp in one hand. The wick turned low. He saw her. He saw the white dress, the loose hair, the bruise that was fading to a sickly yellow on her cheek. "Lila," he breathed. "May I come in?" she whispered. He stepped back without a word. She entered the small room. It smelled of him, of leather and tobacco and the warmth of a human body in a small space. He set the lamp on the crate and turned to her. The light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was a plea to his own conscience, not a command to her. "I cannot stay in there," she said. Her voice trembled. "It is too cold. Cole, I have been cold for 5 years. I cannot bear it any more. Lila," she took a step toward him. "Look at me. Cole, look at me and tell me to go. Tell me you do not want me here." Cole looked at her. He looked at the woman he had watched from afar. The woman whose quiet strength had captivated him. The woman whose pain mirrored his own. He saw the desperate need in her eyes, the need to be chosen, to be held, to be loved. "I cannot tell you that," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, terrified to touch her. Terrified to break the fragile reality of the moment, Lila closed the distance. She took his hand and pressed it against her cheek, against the very spot where Edwin had struck her. She turned her face into his palm, kissing the rough skin of his lifeline. Cole let out a shuddering breath. His other hand came up to hold her, his fingers threading into her hair. The touch was electric, scorching. "I am so afraid," she whispered against his skin. "I know," he said. "I am too, but I am more afraid of living without this," she said. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears and determination. "My husband is in the next room," she whispered. The words hung in the air. The first time she had said them, they were a barrier, a warning. Stop. But tonight, they were a surrender. They were a confession. "He is there, but I am here. I am choosing you." "Then let's stay quiet," Cole answered, the words a vow. He lowered his head. Lila rose on her tiptoes to meet him. The kiss was not like the kisses in the dime novels. It was desperate. It was the collision of two starving people finding sustenance. It tasted of salt and tears and pent-up longing. Cole's mouth was hot and firm, devouring her sigh. Lila wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, needing to feel the solidity of him against her. He groaned low in his throat, a sound of pure want, and pulled her body flush against his. The shock of full contact was overwhelming. She felt the hardness of his chest, the strength of his thighs, the rapid, thundering beat of his heart. They clung to each other, swaying in the dim light. It was a kiss that tried to erase years of loneliness in a single moment. Cole pulled back slightly, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. "Are you sure, Lila? Once we cross this line, there is no going back. The world will not forgive us." "Let them judge," she said fiercely. "They do not live my life. They do not know what it is to be invisible." She kissed him again, softer this time, pleading, "Make me real, Cole, please." His resistance shattered. He swept her up into his arms, carrying her the 2 steps to the narrow cot. He laid her down on the rough wool blanket, following her down, his body covering hers, shielding her from the cold, from the world, from the man sleeping 20 feet away. Their intimacy was a quiet, frantic thing. There were no words, only the rustle of fabric and the sound of shallow breathing. They explored each other with a sense of wonder and urgency. Cole's hands, so large and capable of violence, were impossibly gentle as they traced the curve of her waist, the line of her throat. He worshipped her with his touch, treating her body like something sacred that had been mishandled for too long. Lila wept silently, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being touched with kindness. She arched into him, her hands gripping his shoulders, anchoring herself to him. Every creak of the floorboards made their hearts leap, freezing them in terror, waiting for the sound of Edwin's footsteps. But the footsteps never came, only the wind outside, masking their stolen gasps. When it was over, they lay tangled together under the quilt. The lamp had burned low, casting a dying orange glow. Lila rested her head on Cole's chest, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. His arm was wrapped around her, holding her tight, as if he expected the wind to try and snatch her away. She felt a strange sensation. It was not shame. She had expected shame. She had expected the crushing weight of sin that the preacher warned about. But she did not feel it. She felt alive. She felt the blood moving in her veins. She felt the warmth of another human being. She felt, for the first time since she was 16 years old, that she belonged to herself, because she had freely given herself to someone who cherished the gift. Cole kissed the top of her head. "You have to go," he whispered into her hair. His voice was heavy with regret. "The sun will be up in an hour." "I know," she murmured. She did not want to move. She wanted to stay in this small, drafty room forever. But she knew the rules of the game they were now playing. Survival demanded deception. She sat up, gathering her nightdress, smoothing her hair. She looked at Cole. He watched her with a gaze that was possessive and tender and terrified. "Will you look at me tomorrow?" she asked. "I will look at you every day," he said. "Until they put me in the ground." Lila leaned down and kissed him one last time, a quick, hard press of lips. Then she slipped out of the bed. She opened the door. Peering into the dark hallway, it was empty. The house was silent save for Edwin's snoring. She padded back down the hall, her feet numb. She slipped back into the bedroom. Edwin had not moved. He lay on his back, his mouth open, smelling of whiskey and oblivion. Lila climbed into the bed beside him. She pulled the covers up to her chin. She lay rigid, staring at the dark ceiling. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the window pane. She knew that when the sun rose, everything would look the same. The store would still need sweeping. The flour would still need measuring. Edwin would still be sour and demanding. But everything had changed. She was no longer the dutiful, invisible wife. She was a woman with a secret. She had crossed the line. She had tasted the forbidden fruit, and it was sweet. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she would risk everything, her home, her reputation, her very life, to taste it again. The summer of 1879 did not just arrive, it attacked. The spring mud hardened into a crust of iron-gray earth that cracked open like a thirsty mouth, and the wind shifted from the biting gales of winter to a furnace blast that withered the buffalo grass before it could fully seed. The sun hung in the sky like a blister, white-hot and unblinking, bleaching the color out of the Wyoming plains until the world looked like an overexposed photograph. Under this oppressive heat, the secret life of Lila Mercer and Cole Ryder bloomed like a cactus flower, thorny, desperate, and vividly alive amidst the desolation. Their love was a thing of stolen seconds and hushed urgency. It existed in the shadow of the hayloft when Edwin was at the bank, in the fleeting brush of fingers as Lila passed a sack of grain to Cole in the storeroom, and in the dark. Breathless hours of the night when Lila would creep through the hallway to the lean-to, guided by the creak of the floorboards she had memorized. They did not have the luxury of courtship. There were no long walks by the creek, for the creek had dried to a trickle of mud, and the eyes of the town were everywhere. Instead, their intimacy was compressed into moments of high-stakes danger. One afternoon in July, the heat was so intense that the air shimmered above the corral fences. Edwin was asleep in the parlor, a wet cloth over his face to ward off a headache brought on by the glare. Lila had gone to the barn under the pretense of checking the hens for eggs. She found Cole in the loft, shifting bales of hay to make room for the new delivery. He was stripped to the waist, his skin slick with sweat and dust, the scars on his chest standing out in relief against his tanned skin. When he saw her, he dropped the hay hook and moved toward her without a word. They came together in the shadows, frantic and hungry. There was no gentleness in the heat, only a fierce need to affirm that they were still alive, still real, in a world that was trying to grind them into dust. He pressed her against the rough wood of the support beam, his hands tangling in her hair, his mouth devouring her sigh. "I thought you would never come," he whispered against her neck, the words tasting of salt. "He is asleep," Lila gasped, clutching his shoulders. "The heat, it knocked him out. Let him sleep," Cole growled. "Let him sleep for 100 years. Afterward, they sat in the straw, listening to the buzzing of a dirt dauber wasp near the roof. Lila traced the long, white scar on Cole's ribs with her finger. "We cannot keep doing this," she said softly. "The fear, it is eating me. Cole, every time he looks at me, I think he knows. He suspects," Cole admitted, taking her hand and kissing the knuckles. "But he does not know. Not for sure. He will know." She said, "He is not a fool. And the town, Mrs. Miller looked at me yesterday in the street. She did not say hello. She just looked at my stomach and then at my face, and she smirked." "Let them look," Cole said, though his eyes darkened. Lila rested her head on his shoulder. "Where would we go if we left?" Cole was silent for a moment. He looked out through the gaps in the barn siding at the shimmering, brown horizon. "West," he said. "Over the divide. There is a valley in Idaho I saw once. Green grass, lilac, water that runs clear all year round. The mountains are so high they scrape the sky. Is it peaceful? It is quiet, he said. No one knows us there. No one knows about the debts or the store or the past. We could build a cabin, raising horses, maybe just a small herd. Lila closed her eyes, letting the image wash over her like cool water. A cabin, a garden where the tomatoes did not wither on the vine, a life where she did not have to hold her breath every time a door slammed. It sounds like heaven, she whispered. It is just Earth, Cole said. But it would be our Earth. But the cost, Lila said, her voice trembling. You know what they will say. They will hunt us. Cole, Edwin will send the law. They will call me a whore. They will call you a thief. Let them call me whatever they want, Cole said fiercely. As long as I wake up with you beside me, I do not care if the whole world curses my name. It was a beautiful dream, but it was fragile as spun glass. The reality outside the barn was far crueler. The drought deepened. The cattle that had survived the winter began to die of thirst or dust fever. Edwin's temper rose with the temperature. The crooked deal with Mr. Harrow had bought him time, but the interest payments were crippling, and the cattle baron was becoming impatient. Harrow had ridden out twice in the last week, sitting on his fine horse while Edwin stood in the dirt, sweating and making excuses. Lila saw the way Edwin looked at her after those meetings. It was a look of calculation mixed with loathing. He blamed her for his failures. If she had been more charming to Harrow, more accommodating, perhaps the terms would have been easier. And then, the trap began to close. It started with a neighbor, old Mr. Henderson, who had eyes like a hawk and a tongue like a rasp. He had been riding past the Mercer place late one evening and had seen two silhouettes by the corral fence. Too close, too intimate to be a master and a servant. He mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it to the church choir, and by Sunday, the rumor had reached the ears of Edwin Mercer. Edwin did not confront them immediately. That was not his way. Edwin was a storekeeper. He took inventory. He began to watch. He started sending Lila on errands that made no sense. Take this water to Ryder in the north pasture, he would say, his eyes fixed on her face, watching for the flush of excitement. Go help Ryder sort the tack, he would order, then sneak around the back of the barn to listen at the cracks. Lila felt his gaze like a physical weight. She tried to be careful. She tried to keep her distance. But love, once unleashed, is hard to leash again. One Tuesday evening in August, the air was thick enough to chew. The sun had set, but the heat radiated from the ground in waves. Edwin sat at the kitchen table, the ledger open before him. But he was not reading. He was staring at the back door. Lila was washing dishes, the water lukewarm and greasy. Where is Ryder? Edwin asked suddenly. Lila stiffened. In the bunk, I suppose, or the barn. He spends a lot of time in the barn for a man with no cattle to feed, Edwin said. He is fixing the stalls, Lila said, keeping her eyes on the suds. For winter. Winter is 4 months away. Edwin sneered. He stood up and walked to the window. He peered out into the darkness. They are laughing at me. Lila, he said softly. Lila turned, drying her hands on her apron. Who? Edwin. The town. Harrow. The preacher. They think I am a blind fool. They think I cannot see what is right under my nose. I do not know what you mean. Do not lie to me. He spun around, his face twisted into a mask of fury. He crossed the room and grabbed her wrist, the same wrist he loved to squeeze. But this time he twisted it up behind her back, forcing her to cry out and bend forward. Edwin, please, you are hurting me. Hurting you? He laughed, a high, jagged sound. You have hurt me. Lila, you have made me a cuckold in my own house. I haven't, I swear. He shoved her against the table, pinning her there with his hip. His face was inches from hers, smelling of stale coffee and rage. Tell me, he hissed, have you lain with him? Lila stared at him, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream no and beg for mercy. It would have been the smart thing to do. It would have bought her safety. But she looked into his eyes that had never looked at her with kindness, eyes that saw her as property, and she could not do it. To lie would be to cheapen what she had with Cole. To lie would be to admit that Edwin owned her soul as well as her body. She pressed her lips together and remained silent. The silence stretched out, heavy and damning. Edwin's face went slack with shock, and then it hardened into something murderous. "You whore," he whispered. He released her with a shove that sent her crashing to the floor. He turned and marched toward the hallway cupboard where he kept the shotgun he used for coyotes. "Edwin, no!" Lila screamed, scrambling to her feet. He grabbed the gun and a handful of shells from the box on the shelf. He broke the breech, loading the weapon with shaking hands. "I will kill him," Edwin said, his voice terrifyingly calm now. "I will kill him like the dog he is, and then I will watch you weep for him." He slammed the breech shut and stormed out the back door into the night. "Cole!" Lila screamed. She ran after him. She did not stop to put on shoes. She ran barefoot across the porch and into the dirt of the yard. The dry earth was full of burrs and sharp stones, but she did not feel them. All she felt was a terror so absolute it eclipsed pain. The night was dark, the moon obscured by a haze of dust. The only light came from the lantern hanging near the barn door, casting a sickly yellow pool of illumination on the dry ground. Edwin was marching toward the barn, the shotgun held across his chest. "Ryder," he shouted. "Come out, you coward!" Lila ran, her breath tearing at her lungs. "Edwin, stop, please!" She caught up to him just as he reached the corral gate. She grabbed the sleeve of his coat, trying to drag him back. "Let him go," she begged. "We will leave. We will go away and never come back. You will never see us again." Edwin spun on her, swinging the barrel of the gun around. He struck her on the shoulder with the woodstock, knocking her into the dirt. "You do not give orders here," he roared. "You are mine, inside the barn." Cole had heard the shouting. He had been asleep in the loft, but the sound of Lila's scream had woken him instantly. He scrambled down the ladder, his boots hitting the dirt floor just as Edwin kicked the barn door open. Cole did not have his gun belt on. It was hanging on a nail by the stall. He was unarmed, dressed only in trousers and a shirt, facing a man with a loaded shotgun and nothing to lose. Edwin stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the night sky. He saw Cole standing by the stalls. "There you are," Edwin sneered. "The great lover. Put the gun down." "Edwin," Cole said, his hands raised slowly, palms out. "This does not have to end like this. It ended the moment you touched her." Edwin spat. He raised the shotgun. Lila scrambled up from the dirt outside and rushed into the barn. "Edwin!" Edwin fired. The boom of the shotgun was deafening in the enclosed space. The flash lit up the barn like a lightning strike. Cole threw himself to the side, diving behind a support post. The buckshot tore into the wood where his head had been a second before, sending splinters flying. One pellet grazed his shoulder, tearing through his shirt and drawing a line of blood. But he was alive. The horses in the stalls went mad. The explosion and the smell of powder sent them into a frenzy. They kicked against the wood, squealing in panic. The roan gelding reared up, its hooves smashing against the stall door. In the chaos, the lantern that had been hanging on a hook near the door was knocked loose, perhaps by the recoil of the gun, or perhaps by Lila as she rushed in. It fell to the dirt floor with a crash of glass. Oil spilled out, soaking into the dry straw that littered the aisle. The flame caught instantly. It was not a slow burn. The barn was a tinderbox of dry wood and hay that had been baking in the heat for months. The fire leaped up with a hungry roar, climbing the stall walls and licking at the loft. "Fire!" Lila screamed. Edwin did not look at the fire. He was fumbling to reload the second barrel, his fingers slick with sweat and shaking with adrenaline. Cole saw his chance. He lunged from behind the post, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. He crashed into Edwin, slamming him against the wall. The shotgun fell from Edwin's hands, clattering onto the floor. The 2 men grappled. It was a brawl of desperation. Edwin was smaller, but he was fueled by a manic, hysterical strength. He clawed at Cole's face, his fingers digging into the scar on Cole's jaw. Cole grunted, driving a knee into Edwin's stomach, trying to wind him. "Stop it!" Lila cried, shielding her face from the heat that was already becoming unbearable. The smoke was filling the air, thick and black. Edwin broke free and dove for the gun. His hand closed around the cold metal of the barrel. Cole threw himself on top of him. He grabbed the stock, trying to wrench it away. They rolled in the dirt, the fire roaring just feet away from them. The horses were screaming now, a terrible, high-pitched sound of pure terror. "Let go!" Cole shouted, coughing in the smoke. "Let go, you fool! I will see you in hell!" Edwin screamed. He twisted the gun, trying to bring the muzzle to bear on Cole's chest. Cole shoved the barrel away, pushing it down between them. They were locked together, chest to chest, hands fighting for control of the trigger guard. Lila watched, paralyzed with horror, the flames reflecting in her wide eyes. There was a sudden, violent struggle. Edwin yanked the gun back. Cole pushed forward. A finger, Lila could not tell whose, slipped into the trigger guard. The second shot rang out. It was muffled by the bodies pressed together. There was no flash this time, only a dull thud and a jerk of limbs. Edwin Mercer went rigid. His eyes went wide, staring up at the smoke-filled rafters. Then, all the tension went out of him. He slumped back against the dirt, his hands sliding off the gun. Cole rolled away, gasping for air. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, staring at the man lying before him. There was a dark stain spreading across the center of Edwin's chest, soaking into his white shirt. Edwin let out a long, rattling breath, and then he was still. Cole knelt there, frozen. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold himself up. He looked at his own hands, then at the gun lying in the dirt. He did not know. In the confusion, in the smoke, in the struggle, he did not know if he had pulled the trigger or if Edwin had done it himself by accident. "Cole!" Lila's voice broke through the haze. She was beside him, grabbing his arm. "We have to get out! The roof!" Cole looked up. The flames had reached the hayloft. The entire upper structure of the barn was an inferno. Sparks were raining down like deadly snow. He stumbled to his feet, grabbing Lila. He looked at Edwin's body one last time. There was nothing to be done. The man was gone. "Come on!" Cole shouted over the roar of the fire. He dragged Lila out of the barn, into the cool night air. They stumbled into the yard, collapsing in the dirt near the water trough. Behind them, the barn groaned. With a sound like a thunderclap, the roof collapsed inward, sending a pillar of sparks and flame shooting 50 feet into the night sky. The heat was intense, searing their faces even from this distance. The horses that had not been turned out were gone. Their screams had stopped. Lila sat in the dirt, her chest heaving. Soot streaked across her face. She looked at the burning pyre that had been her husband's pride. Lights were appearing in the distance, lanterns bobbing in the dark, the sound of shouting. The townsfolk were coming. They had seen the fire. Lila looked at Cole. He was sitting with his head in his hands, the blood from his grazed shoulder dripping onto the dry earth. He looked broken. "He is dead," Lila whispered. The words felt foreign in her mouth. Cole nodded slowly. He did not look up. "They will say I did it," he said. His voice was hollow, stripped of all hope. "Even if I did not, they will say I did." Lila reached out and touched his arm. Her hand was trembling. She looked at the fire, and then at the darkness surrounding them. She realized then that the dream of the cabin in Idaho, the garden, the quiet life, it had all burned up with the barn. There was no running away to a clean start. There was only this, the ashes, the body, the judgment. The first of the townsfolk rode into the yard, the sheriff and Mr. Henderson. They jumped from their horses, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of the disaster. "What happened?" the sheriff shouted, running toward them. "Where is Edwin?" Lila looked up at the sheriff. She felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. She looked at Cole, who was bracing himself for the handcuffs, for the rope. She gripped Cole's hand tight, her fingers interlocking with his. "He is inside," Lila said, her voice clear and carrying over the roar of the fire. "He is gone." The sheriff looked at the inferno, then at the two of them huddled together in the dirt, the hired hand and the widow, holding hands while the husband burned. The look on the sheriff's face was not one of sympathy. It was the look of a man who had just solved a puzzle he did not want to solve. "God help you," the sheriff whispered. Lila closed her eyes and leaned her head against Cole's shoulder. The tragedy was complete. The secret was out, and as the flames consumed the last of her old life, she knew that the fight for their new one had only just begun. The smoke from the burning barn hung over Silver Creek for 3 days. It was a thick, oily pall that tasted of charred wood and roasted flesh, a grim reminder that hovered in the nostrils of every man, woman, and child in the valley. It settled on the laundry lines and seeped into the cracks of the window frames, staining the town gray. For Lila Mercer, the smoke was a shroud. She sat in the parlor of the house that was no longer a home. The silence was absolute. Edwin was gone. His body lay in the back room of the undertaker's shop, awaiting a box of pine. Cole Ryder sat in the single-iron cell at the back of the sheriff's office, guarded by a deputy with a shotgun across his knees. The judgment of the town had been swift and brutal, in the absence of a newspaper. Gossip was the only news, and it traveled faster than a telegraph wire. By noon the day after the fire, the story had been written, edited, and published in the minds of the populace. Cole Ryder, the drifting saddle tramp, had seduced the wife of a pious merchant, and when caught in his sin, he had murdered the husband to clear the path to her bed. It was a simple story. It was a moral story. It confirmed every sermon Reverend Thomas had ever preached about the dangers of lust and the treachery of strangers. Lila had to walk through that story when she went to the pump for water. She stepped off her porch, a bucket in her hand. She wore black, a dress she had dyed hurriedly in a bucket of boiling walnut shells the night before. As she walked down the main street, the town stopped. Mrs. Gable was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the millinery shop. She stopped, her broom held like a weapon. She looked at Lila, and then she deliberately turned her back, sweeping the dust into the street with angry, sharp strokes. 2 cattle drovers standing outside the saloon stopped their conversation. One of them spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt near Lila's hem. "Whore," he muttered. The word was not shouted. It was dropped like a stone, heavy and hard. Lila heard it. She felt it strike her chest. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on the horizon, on the blue-gray mountains that looked so cool and distant. She filled her bucket, the squeak of the pump handle sounding like a scream in the silence, and walked back. She felt the weight of their scorn like stones in her pockets. It dragged at her skirts. It made her shoulders ache. She was 24 years old, and she had become a ghost in her own life. The hearing was set for Thursday, since the town hall had suffered a collapsed roof in the last snow and had not yet been repaired. The inquiry was held in the church. It was a fitting venue. The townsfolk whispered. It was a matter of sin as much as a matter of law. The pews were full. People who had not attended a service in 10 years squeezed into the back rows, their hats in their hands, their eyes bright with the anticipation of a hanging. The air was stifling, smelling of damp wool, sweat, and judgment. Sheriff Miller sat at a small table near the altar, looking weary. He was a man who had seen too much of the frontier to believe in simple stories, but he was also a man who knew that a mob needed only a spark to ignite. Beside him sat the circuit judge, who had ridden in that morning, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen too many hangings. Cole was brought in through the side door. He was shackled, his hands cuffed in front of him. He had been beaten. There was a dark bruise blossoming on his cheekbone, likely from a deputy's rifle butt, and his lip was split. He walked with his head up, though his limp was pronounced. He scanned the crowd, his eyes finding Lila in the front row. He did not smile, but his gaze lingered on her for a second, anchoring her. Mr. Harrow sat on the other side of the aisle, looking grieving and righteous. He had appointed himself the voice of the deceased, a role that suited his ambition to acquire the Mercer land perfectly. "This man," Harrow said, standing and pointing a manicured finger at Cole, "is a snake. I saw it myself. I warned poor Edwin. I said, 'Brother Mercer, there is a wolf in your fold,' but Edwin was a charitable man. He took this drifter in, he fed him, he clothed him, and how was he repaid? With betrayal, with theft, and finally, with murder." Harrow turned to the crowd, playing them like a fiddle. "We all know the truth," Harrow boomed. He wanted the woman, and he wanted the ranch. So he burned the barn to hide his crime and shot a good man in cold blood. A murmur of agreement rippled through the pews. "Hang him," someone whispered. "String him up." Sheriff Miller pounded the table. "Order. This is a hearing, not a revival meeting. Sit down." "Harrow." The judge looked over his spectacles. "Call the witness. Mrs. Mercer." Lila stood up. Her legs felt like water. She walked to the front of the church, conscious of every eye boring into her back. She took the seat beside the table. She placed her hand on the Bible, the leather cool under her palm. "State your name." The judge said, "Lila Mercer." "Mrs. Mercer." The judge said, his voice dry as dust, "You were present at the barn on the night of August 12th. Tell us what happened." Lila looked out at the faces. She saw Mrs. Gable, righteous and hard. She saw the preacher, condemning. She saw Harrow, smug and waiting for her to seal Cole's fate. And she saw Cole. He was looking at his hands, his shoulders hunched. He was resigned. He expected her to save herself. He expected her to lie, to paint him as the villain so that she might salvage some scrap of her reputation. If she stayed silent about the truth, Cole would hang. If she spoke, she would be ruined. She looked at the stained glass window, at the image of a shepherd. She thought of the cold nights in the lean-to. She thought of the way Cole had looked at her when no one else would. Not as a fixture, but as a woman. She took a breath. The air tasted of stale incense and fear. "My husband was not a good man," she said. The silence that fell over the church was absolute. The judge blinked. "Excuse me?" "Edwin Mercer was not a saint," Lila said, her voice gaining strength. "He was a cruel man. He was a small man who made himself feel big by hurting those who could not fight back." She rolled up the sleeve of her black dress. She revealed the yellow-green bruises on her upper arm, the marks of fingers that had squeezed too hard. "He gave me these," she said, "because I spilled a sack of flour." A gasp went through the women in the room. "And Mr. Harrow," she continued, turning to look at the cattle baron, "knows the truth of Edwin's desperation. He knows that Edwin tried to trade me, his own wife, to settle a debt." Harrow's face went purple. "That is a lie. This woman is hysterical. Sit down," the sheriff roared. "Let her speak." Lila turned back to the judge. "Cole Ryder did not steal me. I went to him." The words hung in the air, shocking and naked. "I went to him because I was starving," Lila said, her voice trembling but clear. "Not for food, but for kindness. For 5 years, I lived in a house where I was invisible. I was a servant with a ring. Cole saw me. He treated me with honor, even when I did not know how to receive it." She looked at Cole then, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "On the night of the fire, Edwin confronted me. He twisted my arm until I screamed. He grabbed his shotgun. He went out to the barn to kill Cole. He said he would kill him like a dog." She took a shuddering breath. "I ran after him. I saw it. Cole was unarmed. He came out with his hands empty. He begged Edwin to put the gun down, but Edwin fired. He fired first. He shot at an unarmed man. The fire started because the lantern was knocked over in the panic." She gripped the edge of the table. Cole tried to stop him. He tackled him. They fought for the gun. I saw it. I saw them struggling in the dirt. The second shot. It went off in the fight. Cole did not murder my husband. My husband died because his own hate pulled the trigger." She slumped back in the chair, exhausted. The church was in chaos. People were shouting. The preacher was standing on a pew, pointing a finger. "Adulteress! Jezebel. She admits it. She admits her sin. But others were silent. The blacksmith, who had seen Edwin cheat him on a bill, looked thoughtful. Mrs. Miller, who had bruises of her own that she covered with powder, looked at Lila with a strange, terrified recognition. The judge banged his gavel until the handle nearly cracked. Silence! Silence in this court! He turned to Sheriff Miller. You investigated the scene? I did, the sheriff said, standing up. He looked at the crowd, his hand resting on his gun belt. I found the shotgun. Both barrels fired. I found pellet marks in the barn post, high up, where Ryder says he was standing. That backs the woman's story. Edwin fired first. The judge nodded slowly. And the second shot? Point-blank range. The sheriff said, upward trajectory, consistent with a struggle over the weapon. The judge leaned back. He looked at Cole, then at Lila, then at the mob that was barely contained in the pews. This court finds, the judge said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, that the death of Edwin Mercer was a result of misadventure during an act of self-defense. Harrow jumped up. This is an outrage. You are letting a murderer walk free. Sit down. Harrow, the sheriff barked. However, the judge continued, raising his voice, there is the matter of the peace and the matter of public decency. He looked at Cole. Cole Ryder, you are cleared of the charge of murder, but you are a catalyst for violence in this town. Your presence here is a disruption to the moral order. Sheriff Miller stepped forward. He looked at Cole with a hard, weary expression. I cannot protect you here. Ryder, the sheriff said flatly, half this town wants to see you swing, law or no law, and frankly, I do not have the deputies to hold them back once the sun goes down. The sheriff took a set of keys from his belt and unlocked the cuffs on Cole's wrists. The metal clattered onto the table. You are free to go, the sheriff said, but you will leave Silver Creek. You will be gone by sunrise. If I see you within the town limits after the sun clears the horizon, I will arrest you for vagrancy and disturbing the peace, and I will let the town do what they want. Do you understand? Cole rubbed his wrists. He looked at the sheriff, then at Lila. I understand, he said, his voice raspy. Court dismissed, the judge shouted. The room erupted. People surged into the aisle. Lila stood up. Feeling dizzy, she was pushed and jostled. No one touched her with kindness. They pulled their skirts away as if she were contagious. She was the Scarlet Woman now. She had confessed her sin to the world. She pushed her way through the crowd, out the heavy oak doors, and into the blinding afternoon sun. She stood on the steps, gasping for air. Cole was led out the back door by the sheriff to retrieve his horse from the livery. He did not look back. Lila walked home alone. The house was empty. The silence was louder than the shouting in the church. She stood in the center of the kitchen, looking at the stove she had tended, the floor she had scrubbed, the window where she had watched the seasons change. She had saved Cole's life, but she had destroyed her own. She could stay. She owned the land now. Assuming Harrow didn't find a way to steal it, she could live here, a pariah, the widow who slept with the hired hand. She could endure the whispers, the isolation, the slow death of the soul. Or she could leave. She looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 4 in the afternoon. Sunrise was 14 hours away. She went to the bedroom. She pulled a leather satchel from the closet. She did not pack the china. She did not pack the silver. She packed 2 sturdy dresses, a warm wool shawl, a bag of dried apples, and the small tin box where she kept the few dollars she had saved from the egg money. She walked out of the house. She did not lock the door. She did not care who took what. She walked through the twilight to the ruins of the barn. The air was cooling, the heat of the day bleeding away into the purple bruise of the evening sky. The smell of ash was strong here. Cole was there. He was standing by the corral fence, saddling the roan gelding. He had recovered his gun belt from the sheriff, and it hung low on his hips. He looked up when he heard her approach. He stopped cinching the saddle. He looked at her satchel. He looked at her face, which was pale and set with a terrifying resolve. Lila, he said softly. I am ready, she said. Cole shook his head. He walked over to her, his limp pronounced. He took her by the shoulders. His hands were gentle, but firm. "No," he said, "you are not going. Cole." "Listen to me," he pleaded, his eyes searching hers. "The sheriff was right. I have to go. I am a marked man. Lila, I have nothing, no money, no land, just a horse and a bad reputation. I do not care about money," she said. "You should," he said. "It is a hard life. Lila, sleeping on the ground, hungry, cold. You have a house here. You have the store. Harrow will back off now that the law has spoken. You can rebuild. You can be respectable again. In time, they will forget. They will never forget," she said. "And neither will I." "I cannot drag you into the mud with me," Cole said, his voice cracking. "I love you too much to see you suffer. I want you to have a life. A good life." Lila reached up and placed her hands on his face. She felt the stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "A good life?" she repeated. "Cole, look at me. Was my life good before you came?" He fell silent. "I was dead," she whispered. "I was walking around, breathing, working, but I was dead. You woke me up. Do you think I can go back to sleep now? Do you think I can stay in that house with his ghost in every corner and pretend that I did not touch fire?" She stepped closer, pressing her body against his. "I am done with respectability," she said fiercely. "I am done with being what they want me to be. I choose you. I choose the hunger. I choose the cold. I choose the mud. As long as I am with you." Cole looked at her. He saw the steel in her eyes, the same steel that had made her stand up in the church and bare her soul to save him. He realized then that he could not leave her, not because he needed her, though he did, but because she had earned the right to choose her own fate. He let out a long breath, a sound of surrender. "It will be hard," he warned, leaning his forehead against hers. "I know," she said. "We might not make it to the mountains before the snow flies. Then we will find shelter along the way." He closed his eyes and pulled her into his arms. He held her with a desperation that shook them both. He kissed her, not with the frantic heat of the barn, but with a deep, aching slowness. It was a kiss that sealed a pact. It was a goodbye to the safety they had never really had, and a vow to the danger that lay ahead. "I will saddle the mare," he said against her lips. They worked in silence in the fading light. Cole saddled the mare that had belonged to Edwin, adjusting the stirrups for Lila. They tied their bedrolls behind the saddles. They filled their canteens from the trough. They did not speak of the town. They did not speak of the trial. They spoke only of the cinch, the rain, the road. They waited until the moon set, in the darkest hour before the dawn, when the world was a palette of deep blues and grays. They mounted their horses. The air was cold, biting with the promise of autumn. Cole looked at Lila. She sat straight in the saddle, her satchel slung across her shoulder, her profile sharp against the stars. She did not look back at the house. She did not look back at the town. Her eyes were fixed on the west, where the mountains were just a jagged shadow against the sky. "Ready?" he whispered. Lila took a breath. She tasted the ash in the air, but beneath it, she smelled the sagebrush and the wind. "Yes," she said. They turned their horses and rode out. They rode past the sleeping church, past the sheriff's office, past the darkened windows of the general store. Their hooves were muffled by the dust. They were just two silhouettes, moving like smoke through the town that had tried to crush them. They passed the edge of town, where the road turned into open prairie. The sun began to bleed over the eastern horizon behind them, casting long, pale shadows that stretched out ahead of them like fingers pointing the way. They left behind the judgment. They left behind the shame. They rode into the vast, indifferent silence of the Wyoming plains, and for the first time in their lives, they were free. Epilogue. The winter came early that year in Idaho. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. It sat in a high valley, sheltered by a stand of lodgepole pines. with a creek running fast and clear just 50 yards from the door. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth. The room was simple. A table made of split planks, a bed in the corner covered with a buffalo robe, a few shelves holding tin plates and a small stack of books. Lila stood by the window, watching the snow fall. It was a gentle snow, huge flakes drifting down in the silence. She was thinner than she had been in Silver Creek. Her hands were rougher, calloused from chopping wood and hauling water. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. The door opened, and a gust of cold air swirled into the room. Cole stepped inside, stomping the snow from his boots. He carried a string of rabbits over his shoulder. He looked older, too. The gray at his temples had spread, and the limp was stiff on cold days like this. He hung the rabbits by the door and took off his heavy coat. He walked over to the fire, rubbing his hands together. "It is settling in," he said. "The pass will be closed by morning." Lila turned from the window. "We have enough wood," she said, "and the flour will last." Cole turned to look at her. He studied her face in the firelight. He saw the scars she carried, the invisible ones. He knew she sometimes woke up crying from dreams of fire. He knew she missed the music of a piano she no longer had, but he also saw the peace. He walked over to her. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a question he asked her sometimes, when the wind howled and the work was hard. Lila looked at the cabin. It was small. It was isolated. They were poor. When they went into the nearest settlement for supplies, people still looked at them with suspicion, the scarred man and the quiet woman with no wedding ring. But then she looked at him. She looked at the man who had ridden through fire for her, the man who listened when she spoke, the man who touched her with a tenderness that still made her knees weak. She squeezed his hand. "I'm not afraid, Cole," she said softly. He smiled, the expression softening the harsh lines of his face. "No," he said, "neither am I." He pulled her into his arms, and they stood by the window, watching the snow bury the world in white. They were miles from anywhere, anchored only by the heat of the fire and the fierce, enduring love that had been forged in the ashes of their old lives. They were scarred, yes, but they were standing. And as the night settled over the mountains, the quiet girl and the lonely cowboy finally breathed freely. Thank you so much for journeying with me through this story of Lila and Cole. I hope their struggle for freedom and love in the harsh Wyoming frontier resonated with you. I would love to hear your thoughts on their ending. Do you think they made the right choice? Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. It is always wonderful to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier, the outlaws, and the quiet heroes of the American West. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.